So here's a little tidbit about me most people don't know. While my first gaming experiences may have been with platformers and side-scrollers on the NES, and my rise to what you might call prominence here on YouTube comes from survival horror games, 16-bit JRPGs were my real introduction to this industry. Even to this day, more than half of my 600 game collection is made up of RPGs, but Final Fantasy in particular has always had a special place in my heart. So without a doubt, a modern, more intricate dive into this world is just what the doctor ordered, right? Well, in my opinion, not entirely. The FF7 remake stands out in an industry currently flush with remakes, and sadly, that is not for the right reasons. But why though? I mean, on paper it's a guaranteed home run. Well, to be honest with you, the idea behind this video started as a review, but it kind of turned into an analysis of what made the original work so well. So today let's take a bit of a deep dive into one of gaming's most important titles and why its modern remake may have crumbled under the weight of that importance. What's up guys, I'm Jared and this is Avalanche Reviews. Okay, before we start this, I want to make one thing very clear. I absolutely love the Final Fantasy VII Remake. It is an immensely fun action RPG in an industry where that type of game does not come around very often. On top of that, just seeing some of these people and places brought to life in such a realistic way legitimately brought a tear to my eye on more than one occasion. That's not hyperbole. So if you came here for a hot take on this remake being garbage, you may want to go elsewhere. Instead, my intent here is to point out all the areas where the remake falls short of the original in my opinion, and more to the point, why that is. So if you're using this video to make a decision on whether or not you should buy FF7, keep in mind failing to live up to one of the greatest and most important events in modern gaming history is not the same thing as failing to make a great game. This is a very unique situation we have here, one with a lot of nuance that may require a little more deep thinking than your average numerical score could express. And no, this isn't going to be some soft-headed, pseudo-intellectual, but what really is a remake conversation. Far more talented people than I have already done that concept to death. Plus, it seems like most of the people who didn't want a one-to-one remake are the ones so disappointed by how much has been changed here. Man, talk about cutting off your nose to spite your face. Well, anyways, if you're with me on all this nonsense, let's dive in. Oh, and I don't think I'll be able to avoid spoilers here, so continue at your own discretion.
All right, y'all good to go? Then let's do this thing.
First things first, I have to repeat myself here. Despite all of its many flaws, Final Fantasy VII Remake is a really fun experience, one that I was thoroughly enamored with, or at least the part of me that was willing to put the original to the side was. I know I already made this clear, but it's worth repeating. The reason I'm going so hard on that point is because this video will be a solid chunk of mostly complaints and downsides, but I think there's a value in critiquing the things we love just as thoroughly as the things we hate. On top of that, I have a lot of opinions on how this remake stacks up next to the original, and I guess that brings us to the methodology behind this video. I anticipated a lot of comments about me being nostalgia blind, and rightly so. I mean, I fell in love with the original FF7 more than 2 decades ago, so it's perfectly reasonable to assume I might be remembering it with rose-tinted glasses. Of course, I do replay the game fairly often, but just in case I was suffering from some kind of things were way better in my day mentality, I decided to set up perfect testing conditions. The idea was to play the original and the remake simultaneously. Me and my wife would sit down, play the remake every night, and when she would go to sleep, I would play up to that same point in the original. I think this allowed me to not only experience the original with a more careful eye, but also let me really take note of what changed in the remake. Not just the surface level stuff like combat and story, but more detail-driven aspects like pacing and overall game feel. So without further ado, let's get into comparing a 2020 Squaresoft release with a 1997 one, and why I think the latter is the more satisfying experience. And right off the bat, surprising nobody, the story is going to be a major sticking point for me. In my opinion, while not perfect, FF7's story was absolutely amazing. I loved the world it set up, and the characters who lived in it felt very real to me. So when I heard there'd be changes made to that story, well, I wasn't thrilled to say the least. Sure, in theory, adding to a great thing can only lead to even more greatness, but anyone who's ever overseasoned a steak can attest to that not being the case. But why was it altered in the first place? I think that's the more important question here. Well, as you all surely know, this remake's going to be broken up into small pieces and released episodically, a move that is dumb from both a financial and storytelling perspective. Now, I know there are those of you out there who follow the "but Square couldn't afford to remake the full game all at once" bullshit, a narrative pushed by the company themselves, which is insane for a nearly infinite amount of reasons. First off, getting funding for a remake of one of the most iconic video games on Earth would be nowhere near a problem for even the most inept Japanese company, let alone one as famous as Squaresoft. Hell, just off the top of my head, Sony'd be willing to cover a large portion of the cost if it meant keeping the game as a PlayStation exclusive, a move they pulled many times in the past, specifically with Squaresoft. The second and more important reason that's bullshit is the first episode of FF7 can be beaten in roundabout the same amount of time it would take a first-timer to beat the original, give or take 10 hours. Are you telling me Square couldn't afford a remake of a 50 or 60-hour game, but 30 or 40 hours was no problem? That's just not reasonable. I mean, we're talking about a company that pulled more than $5 billion in the last fiscal year, plus this is one of their most popular and beloved releases. Not only was the money for a full remake of the entirety of FF7 there from the start, but even more than they would have likely needed given Sony's eagerness to back projects in return for the promise of console exclusivity, which I believe they also did. Not only has that happened before, but it's happened to a Final Fantasy game before. Believe me, I've been following this remake from the beginning, and I've seen every excuse Square has given for its episodic nature. I can assure you none of them are true. In my opinion, there are two and only two possible explanations for this move. The first and most obvious is a money play. Take a relatively long game, chop it up into small pieces, and sell each piece for the same price the whole used to cost. An approach that makes a lot of sense in a financial ledger, but not as much when you're the one shelling out the cash for each part. And by chance, if you didn't get the context or the small in-between the lines things I was suggesting there, this is a fucking scum practice. Second, and equally as viable, is I think Square decided to collect investments and start this project a very long time ago, perhaps back when episodic gaming was at its height, because even a wet behind the ears new age gamer knows that approach is long dead, and for good reason. It seems like no one's ever able to finish one of these episodic series, unless like Capcom they finished the whole game ahead of time, which does in fact negate the need for it to be episodic past a greedy desire for even more money. So if you ask me, I think Square was in the process of collecting possible investments and planning this whole thing out back when Telltale was riding high on profits, and they sold this remake as cashing in on that trend, which was a pretty solid bet at the time. If that was indeed the case, it would make sense that development would have been pretty far along by the time episodic-based video games had died a very quick and very violent death, meaning they would have been past the point of no return, locking them into this approach. Of course, I do want to make it clear that I have no proof to back this up besides a very baseline knowledge of how business works and extensive experience watching the game industry grow and fuck up over the years. It's kind of like predicting that the sun's going to come up tomorrow. There is a non-zero chance that I could be wrong, but I think we both know what's going to happen. What I'm trying to say is I could be wrong here, but I think it's a solid bet that one of these two scenarios will explain this mess, because the only alternative is either Square Enix, a multi-billion-dollar company that holds the rights to some of the most influential franchises since Super Mario, just couldn't afford to remake the most popular release in one of those series, or in their entire corporate structure, there was not one single employee who whispered into their boss's ear, "Psst, hey, this doesn't make any fucking sense." Holy hell, that was a long rant. Sorry guys, I know that was a little rough to listen to, but I'm tired of people regurgitating Square press releases at me. To anyone with even the baseline amount of IQ it takes to Google a few things, these numbers just don't add up. So for those of you who haven't nodded off yet, what seems like an hour ago we were talking about how elements had to be added to FF7's story in order to pad the game's length out to 30 or 40 hours. Now, in no way am I about to tell you that these additions were terrible. Honestly, I loved getting to know Jessie more. Her little side story involving her parents and this fucking psycho was cool as hell, but the quality of the individual additions aren't the issue here. It's their effect on the whole that bothers me. In the original game, the pace of the events taking place in Midgar was perfectly executed. Not only were you exploring this incredible little piece of Mad Max meets Akira, but the speed at which story events were occurring gave you this feeling Cloud, and by extension you, were caught up in this whirlwind of craziness. You went from taking part in an act of eco-terrorism that Cloud could care less about, to getting roped into another one with the promise of even more money, to meeting Aeris, to rescuing Tifa, to losing Aeris and busting through the Shinra building, and it all felt like a crazy set of circumstances all happening one after the other. Thanks to the lengthy nature of Remake, these events feel pretty far apart comparatively, which takes away from their effect on the overall story. In the original, the craziness and rapid-fire nature of these story beats never really gave Cloud a chance to think about what he was doing, which let him feel like he was responding to things instinctively, kind of like he had these heroic instincts that were kicking in and overriding his loner mentality he'd been cultivating this entire time. The remake may only make minor changes to this aspect of his character, but that little detail was pretty key in him developing. Like I said before, I'm not mad there were additions made, and truth be told, I loved a lot of them. No joke, the most fun I had with this game came in the form of dancing to impress Andrea Rodea. I actually replayed this section to get a better rating, and to see it again. So my issue isn't that these were added, so much as the whole of the game wasn't altered to account for them. And to be clear, I'm not in favor of altering the base game to make these new additions fit. I'm just saying this kind of half measure just leaves both the new additions and the old story beats feeling worse for it. Without a totally new story, these extra bits end up affecting the pace and momentum of the original content to a degree that's very noticeable if, like me, you played OG FF7 recently. So I guess the real question is, how could this have worked better? Well, I think the answer to that should be pretty obvious. Taking away the episodic nature of this remake means not having to pad out the Midgar portion of the game, meaning the story would be free to follow the same flow as the original. Sure, there would still be room for some expanding on things like the wall market section or Jesse as a character, but these additions would not have been necessary, which would lead to them feeling much more natural in my opinion, because you can argue all you want about how good these extra story events are, and like I said before, I would typically agree, but they are padding at the end of the day. And padding is not something you do when you're incredibly confident in a story that you've written out of love. It's something that happens when penny pitchers above you tell you to increase the length of the story to fit the length of the game. Even if you disagree with that concept, the fact of the matter is these story events were put in specifically to make a very small portion of FF7 feel like a complete game, and it just didn't work in my opinion. There is of course another issue with this approach, and I think it's the more important one. See, FF7 told a very tight and complete story in its original release. The world was expanded on just enough for the player to get a good idea of how things work, and so that they could fill in any gaps with their imagination. The emphasis on over-explaining people and places in the remake takes away from the strides the original made in this area. The original PS1 version of Final Fantasy VII had a terribly detailed, rich story and did an amazing job at world building, but a lot of that was left unsaid. Now, I understand the desire for creators to finally express those small details that may have been in their mind, but it just doesn't have the same effect. Over-explaining something can be a far worse issue than under-explaining it. It's kind of like how a movie based on a book is always a little worse than what you had in your head. There's just no way the creators of this remake could have accounted for each person's own personal interpretation of these things, which is understandable and totally expected, but it could have been avoided. In a perfect world, the only thing that would have been necessary would be sticking to the amount of exposition and world building included in the original, and they would have sidestepped this pitfall, but I guess we don't live in a perfect world, do we?
The stench of the director's cowardice fills the room yet again.
The combat in FF7 Remake is a real-time affair with a light turn-based bend thanks to the inclusion of an active time bar, and if you ask me, this is probably the best job anyone could have done in transferring 7's original turn-based gameplay into an action RPG. It feels really authentic in a lot of ways, and it's clear the developers really wanted fans of the old style to still feel comfortable here. There's a buttload of customization that can be done with certain combinations of materia and equipment, and a lot of fan-favorite limit breaks, animations, and magic spells have been included. That being said, there are some serious issues to talk about. When I said this was probably the best job anyone could have done to transplant an old turn-based system into a modern real-time game, I didn't mean this was a good direction. Personally, and I know I won't be surprising anyone by saying this, I would have preferred for this remake to include turn-based combat, but let's be real, that was never going to happen. As RPG fans, we may have put Square where it is today, but we just gotta face facts. We aren't as numerous now that gaming has grown so large. People who enjoy turn-based JRPGs were always in the minority, but that ratio has grown out of control in the last decade and a half. The fact of the matter is, no modern AAA dev house with stockholders to answer to is going to be caught dead making a turn-based JRPG nowadays. And don't you worry, the sound of you furiously typing away in the comment section is audible from space. Yes, there have been plenty of amazingly popular turn-based JRPGs, and that's kind of my point. Modern-day Squaresoft is chasing the Western dollar, and as much as that sucks, we kind of have to get over it. My point is, I came into this understanding that I wasn't going to get that old style of turn-based gameplay, and honestly I expected worse. but I think it's Square's insistence on staying true to the original that's dragging it down. Combat in FF7 was always about strategically plotting your actions one turn at a time, and the stress of keeping your characters alive and your enemies dead kind of filled in the gaps for a lot of us. This turn-based structure sort of felt real-time in that way, and once you got acclimated to the menu system, it wasn't hard to navigate these blue windows at light speed, further helping fights feel faster and more action-packed, when in reality we were exploring an Excel spreadsheet with animations playing when we chose the right stuff. In the remake, combat is fast and very frantic. I actually liked how much quick thinking is required, and that helped keep me on my toes, but it falls flat in a lot of areas. Like I said, the inclusion of quasi-turn-based mechanics was kind of like the gameplay equivalent of fan service, and it works in that sense, but I honestly think it drags the combat down to a decent degree. The idea of moving around in real time as you make choices in a turn-based fashion is no new concept to Squaresoft. I'm sure some of you remember Parasite Eve or Vagrant's Story, two of the best implementations of this gameplay style and proof that late 90s Square was one of the best companies in the industry. These systems worked almost perfectly in their respective games, so what's the real difference here? Well, both games allow the player to run around dodging attacks and building meter, but they separate from 7 because the second that bar fills up, time essentially stops. We're free to choose our strategy at our own pace, and to be fair, that's nearly the case in Remake. Time slows to an absolute crawl when selecting magic, skills, or items, but it still passes. In Parasite Eve, a player with a good eye could spot the wind-up of an attack, and if need be, could open their menu and choose to buff themselves or heal any lost HP. What I'm trying to say is the AT bar played a huge role in gameplay, and you could sort of use it as a get-out-of-jail card, and it felt awesome narrowly dodging a death thanks to some quick thinking. In Remake, you can definitely see a devastating attack coming and then open your menu, but if the attack is fast enough, you or the person you're trying to heal is going to get hit. No joke, towards the latter parts of the game, getting killed as you're trying to cure yourself becomes an every other encounter kind of thing, but even though I just spent way too long describing this, it's not that big of a deal, or at least it's not the root cause of my frustration. See, the idea of bringing up PE or Vagrant's Story wasn't so much to talk about stopping the game while you're in the menu, but more importantly, I wanted to talk about how time would freeze while your character was performing the selected action. Getting hit during menu navigation can be shitty, but it pales in comparison to perfectly dodging an attack, heading into your menu and quickly selecting just the right response, then being hit out of your attack animation and losing the 2 bars of meter it took to use that attack. This happens way too often, and it's unavoidable a lot of the time. Some attacks will have specific ranges that you can exploit, but the harder enemies can hit with physical attacks that cause hard knockdowns or paralysis from full screen, and as far as I found, the only thing that can't be interrupted are the animations just before a summon, which, by the way, should have been one-time attacks and not controllable, but I digress. The frustration of building meter, using the perfect attack, and getting swatted to the ground like a 2-year-old is so rage-inducing I struggled to describe it to you guys. And it's because Square couldn't pick a side. In a proper real-time game, we would have had some kind of way to account for this kind of nonsense, but since they were balancing for the ability to nearly freeze the game whenever you want, we ended up with a combat system that, while very fun when it works, drove me nearly insane with all of its flaws. Another instance where accuracy hurt the combat system comes in the form of damage. In the original, taking damage was really not up to you. Sure, you could try to increase your luck stat, but whether or not you could actually dodge was still left up to a dice roll. So taking damage was going to happen no matter how good you were. In the real-time environment that is Remake, it'd be relatively easy for a skilled player to dodge nearly everything thanks to the addition of being able to move and the evasive roll. So to balance for this, some attacks hit no matter what, just with decreased damage output. So why is this an issue? I mean, if it doesn't do much damage, what's the big deal? Well, that little bit does tend to add up, but healing in battle is easy enough, assuming you don't get knocked to the ground, paralyzed, put to sleep, or turned into a frog while the animation plays, but it's outside of battle where this becomes a huge problem. In the original, all you had to do was open your menu, select a spell or item, and bam, you were good to go, but that's not possible in the remake. In fact, you can't use any items or spells from this menu for some no doubt completely arbitrary reason. They just can't be used. Sure, you can see them, but they're not usable. Now, in some games, having a real-time menu that doesn't stop the game can work in the favor of its gameplay, especially with situations like Resident Evil Outbreak where you're always in danger, but you're only ever in danger while engaged in a fight in Final Fantasy VII. I don't understand why we need to have a real-time in-game menu like this, especially when we already have a menu that stops all gameplay where we can equip items, material, or level up our equipment. I don't understand why having these two things work together was not an option. So instead of efficiently taking care of all of your issues in one place like the original, in the remake you hit X to open your real-time menu where all of your items and spells could be accessed. The big issue with this is it has to be done multiple times per party member and sometimes multiple times per item. So instead of easily doing this, we have to do this. Healing yourself in this remake is a much slower, less efficient process and adds a lot of tedium to just getting out of a fight, which is a massive pain in the ass for a game that is mostly combat. Seemingly to account for this, there are benches scattered everywhere that will refill all characters' health and MP, but this feels cheap and bordering on catering to the lowest common denominator. No longer does recovering from a fight require you to expend some sort of resource. All you need to do is watch another frustratingly long cutscene of Cloud sitting down. In the original, restoring some kind of stat always cost you something. Gil or MP, either way you were paying. Here in the remake, the ability to make a million mistakes and never have to answer for the consequences feels like a feature that should have been only available in easy mode if you ask me. It's damn near insulting for those of us who do enjoy a good challenge. Now, I'm not talking about beating Dark Souls with a racing wheel kind of challenge, but a fair, satisfying one that JRPGs are usually one to give. And I know it feels like a bit of a contradiction considering my complaint that it was too easy to get knocked out of healing animations and taking damage was unavoidable. On one end, I complain about the game being too cheap, and in the same breath, I talk about how dumbed down and easy it is, which sounds ridiculous, but that's the thing. This game is really easy, all things considered. Sure, plenty of characters died in my playthrough, but a quick item or spell took care of that problem. Hell, thinking back, I only ever got wiped twice, once by sheer dumb luck, and another time in the Colosseum against an enemy with elemental weaknesses while I was trying to focus on a non-attack magic build. The nearly non-existent difficulty mixed with bullshit mechanics that all but guarantee you'll get damaged often combined to make this really unsatisfying feeling where I was being damaged by things I felt were out of my control, and the penalty for this wasn't that I would die and have to try again, but that I would have to sit through the long process of getting that character back on their feet. There's this really odd disconnect between what the devs were going for in the combat and how it comes across to the player. If you ask me, the original turn-based system is the best and only way to experience these iconic fights, but I know that a lot of that may largely be affected by my own bias. So that's why I tore into the combat a little harder than anything else here. Not because I was expecting turn-based and didn't get it, but because I knew they would just import 15's combat and I just didn't expect them to mess it up this bad. One thing I can say about this remake without any reservation is that it looks absolutely incredible. Gorgeous particle effects are in use all over the place, and the main cast looks incredibly realistic, but in that anime-inspired kind of way that I love. But more than the characters, it's clear some genuine loving care went into designing the environments within Midgar. Everything feels larger than life, and the constant intelligent use of scale makes sure you always feel like you're playing in a small portion of a very big world. And since the world is so big, it's a big surprise they jacked up the viewing distance so high. In some areas you can see for what feels like miles. On top of that, lighting plays a giant role in the realistic look of the game. Going from a dark room to the morning sun will blow out white levels until your character's eyes adjust, and depending on the time of day you can get some damn convincing real-time perspective correct shadow casting. Now all these on their own are really cool and they look great, but not really anything to get excited about. That is until I mention how rock solid FF7's frame rate is. No joke, I can't think of a single time I noticed any kind of drop in the frame rate. The game runs at this locked 30 FPS cap, but it doesn't feel that way oddly enough. Most of my time with the game was spent assuming it was 60 frames per second, which is a testament to their clever use of both full camera and per object centered motion blur. On top of that, while I can't test it for myself, I have to assume frame pacing was a huge priority because the game just feels incredible in motion. In total honesty, there were parts where the game transitioned into pre-rendered FMVs and I had no idea. That's how good these in-game graphics look. So I guess you're asking yourself, what could possibly be the complaint here? I mean, I just got done filleting this game's presentation, so how the hell does this fit in with some kind of criticism? Well, FF7's incredibly impressive look sort of works against it in my opinion. The original release of FF7, while not much by modern standards, did an insane amount of stuff with a very limited amount of resources. This meant that we as players had to fill in a lot of blanks with our imagination. This was necessary to see most enemies as they were meant to look and not as a pile of easily countable flat-shaded geometric shapes. The pre-rendered backgrounds were often not to scale and a little sparse in detail sometimes, but that gave our minds this awesome starting point from which we could recreate or reinterpret the world that's being shown to us. Now, I do of course have to commend Remake for doing as good a job as it did bringing these designs into its more advanced, more modern-looking world, but I think that's the exact issue here. The original FF7 looked authentic because it had this cohesive world made up of some incredibly stylized art. Remake takes those stylized assets and gives them a shiny coat of realism, and I think that might work against it. In this place, I could totally imagine this kind of crazy shit going on, but here in this realistic world, the fact that I'm being attacked by a robot made up of different colored tubing seems a little out of place. We go from one scene with a hyper-realistic face that looks like it belongs to a person you could actually meet in real life, to a dragon flying around and characters jumping 12 feet up in the air to attack it. I don't really know the proper term for this, but it feels like dissonance between the more modern and realistic looking aspects of the game to the more fantasy-based ones. It's like they've created this real world and populated it with real people and then dropped in a bunch of faithfully designed monsters that are too stylized and clash with the rest of it. It just doesn't fit with the established realism in my opinion. In the original, the primitive, heavily stylized look made a lot of room for some suspension of disbelief, whereas in the remake, the more true-to-life look of the game kind of draws the eye to all the things that stick out and feel like they don't belong. Now, it's definitely worth mentioning this was an issue that flat out could not have been avoided. There's no chance Modern Square was going to shell out this much hype over a game and then decide it deserves an artistically pleasing style. No, of course they're going to want it to look as realistic as humanly possible, and sadly that means dragging the whole enemy roster out of the uncanny valley and into combat with your party. Of course, this is a minor issue, but it does sit at odds with the serious tone the story takes most of the time. The seriousness does seem to draw from the game's realism and even contributes to it, but it just seems weird when that process is happening while a cartoon cat slams his fist onto the ground in sheer frustration and loss. In closing, I gotta admit to you guys, this video was kind of cathartic for me. Sitting down in front of a keyboard and really hammering through my thoughts on a game can bring some very interesting perspective, and it gives me a chance to take an honest look at the reason why I feel a certain way about the game. And all through FF7, in between gasping at the marvel of finally sitting in front of a remake of one of my favorite games of all time, I had this feeling. A negative, naggy type of feeling. Sure, I was having fun, but I wasn't necessarily happy. Writing all of this down and analyzing things a little more closely was really helpful in identifying that feeling. And while I still can't tell if this is all just the ranting of an old bitter gamer who liked the way things were better back in his day, I feel at least a little more researched on the matter. So yes, I did really like this game in a lot of ways, and I truly appreciate seeing these familiar faces back in action. Honestly, I reveled in the process of exploring a more fleshed out and occupied version of Sector 7, and I genuinely teared up at the idea of jumping off that train and working with Avalanche on a bombing run. But this wasn't the remake Final Fantasy VII deserved. And no, like I said before, this is not some kind of philosophical what really is a remake type of statement. That's clearly defined, I don't know why that's an argument. As far as quality and design goes, this game is not up to the standard of the original, a game that was the product of passion and love. So if there was one final comment I could make here, it would be this. Final Fantasy VII will likely go down in history as a remake that sought to please people who would never like the original, leaving those of us who poured years of our lives into this concept absolutely heartbroken. Hey guys, thanks for sitting through this little depressing video. If you like more Final Fantasy VII related stuff, I'll have something on screen I'm sure, and you guys know the deal. If you like my work, maybe support it on Patreon. If not, subscribe. If not, tell me why you hate me in the comments, but I love you all. Goodbye.